It is the autumn of 1943, and somewhere over the English Channel, a Focke-Wulf 190 is on a routine patrol. The German pilot, experienced and steady, has flown dozens of missions over occupied Europe. He knows the sound of his engine, the feel of the stick, the way the horizon tilts when he banks. He knows this war from the inside of a cockpit. He is not easily frightened. But tonight, something is wrong. It begins subtly. A faint hiss beneath the roar of the engine, a shiver in his controls that doesn't match the weather. Then it comes, a sound unlike anything in nature or in war. Not the crack of flak, not the chatter of machine guns. Something lower, something that vibrates not just in the air but in the pilot's chest, in his stomach, behind his eyes. And then, without warning, his vision begins to blur. His hands tremble uncontrollably on the stick. An overwhelming wave of nausea rolls through him. Panic, raw, irrational, animal panic, floods every rational thought. He breaks off. He turns for home. He lands shaking and pale. And when his ground crew asks what happened, he struggles to find the words. He has encountered something the British have been quietly perfecting in a set of converted workshops on the outskirts of Farnborough. A weapon so strange, so psychologically devastating, that several Luftwaffe pilots who experienced it refused to fly operationally ever again. Not because their aircraft were destroyed, not because they were wounded, but because something invisible had reached inside them and undone them completely. What the British had discovered, and what the Germans never fully understood, was the weapon of sound itself, specifically infrasound, acoustic frequencies so low that the human ear cannot hear them, but the human body absolutely can feel them. And what they built to deliver this invisible assault was one of the most unsettling technological achievements of the Second World War. This is the story of the Fran device, and of the scientists who turned the physics of sound into a weapon of psychological devastation. By mid-1942, the aerial war over Britain and occupied Europe had settled into a brutal rhythm. The Luftwaffe still flew with discipline and skill, and German pilots, particularly those flying the formidable Focke-Wulf 190, remained a serious threat to Allied air superiority. Conventional methods of disruption had been explored and largely exhausted. Anti-aircraft fire was effective but imprecise. Fighter interceptions were costly on both sides. What British military planners increasingly wanted was something that could reach the enemy without a bullet, without a bomb, and without warning. The idea of weaponizing sound was not entirely new. Acoustic mirrors, enormous concrete reflectors built along the British coastline in the 1920s, had demonstrated that sound could be gathered, directed, and used for detection purposes. But the leap from detection to disruption was a considerable one, and the science behind it was barely understood in civilian terms, let alone military ones. The problem was this: conventional sound weapons, if such things existed at all, would need to produce enormous volumes of audible noise to be effective over any meaningful distance. The energy losses were staggering. At the frequencies most weapons designers considered, a device powerful enough to incapacitate a man at a distance of even 50 meters, roughly 164 feet, would require energy outputs that were, at the time, essentially impossible to generate in a portable or semi-portable system. The math simply did not work. What changed everything was a quiet paper circulated in late 1941 within the Acoustic Research Division at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. Its author, a physicist named Dr. Harold Lidstone, noted that the human body was not a uniform structure when it came to sound. Different organs, different cavities, different fluid-filled spaces resonated at different frequencies. The eyes, Lidstone noted, vibrated sympathetically at roughly 18 Hz. The inner ear at frequencies slightly lower. The stomach and intestinal tract, critically, at somewhere between 7 and 9 Hz. These were infrasonic frequencies, below the threshold of human hearing, invisible to any radar, inaudible to any ear. If a device could be built to project sustained infrasound at those frequencies, Lidstone argued the physiological effects would be profound without a single visible trace of what had caused them. The Germans would hear nothing, and yet their pilots would fall apart in the sky. Lidstone's proposal was assigned to a small team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, working under the classified designation Project Harrow. The team included acoustics engineers, physiologists, and at least 2 specialists borrowed from the BBC's Wartime Technical Division, whose experience with high-powered broadcast transmitters proved unexpectedly relevant to the problem of projecting sound energy across distance. The central challenge was straightforward to describe and fiendishly difficult to solve. Infrasound, frequencies below 20 Hz, behaves very differently from the sounds we hear every day. It travels extraordinary distances with minimal loss of energy. It penetrates walls, aircraft fuselages, even the sealed canopies of fighter cockpits with relative ease. A low rumble of 8 Hz generated in Farnborough might, under the right atmospheric conditions, be felt 10 kilometers, roughly 6 miles away. The problem was producing it in sufficient volume and with sufficient directional control to be a useful weapon. The team settled on what they called a rotary infrasonic projector, a device that, in its final form, resembled nothing so much as an enormous industrial fan mounted at the bottom of a metal horn. The horn itself was roughly 4.5 meters, about 15 feet, in length and 1.2 meters, just under 4 feet, across at its mouth, constructed from heavy-gauge steel sheeting. The rotor inside, driven initially by petrol engines and later by an electric motor drawing from a mobile generator, turned at precisely calibrated speeds to produce the desired output frequency. To understand the principle, imagine a large organ pipe, but instead of air being forced through it at a fixed pressure, the airflow itself is interrupted rhythmically, chopped, in effect, by the spinning rotor. Each interruption creates a pulse of compressed air. At low enough rotational speeds, these pulses occur fewer than 20 times per second, producing a frequency below the range of human hearing. The device was, in essence, generating a continuous, powerful, inaudible throb. Early prototypes, tested in an agricultural barn near Farnborough in the spring of 1942, produced output levels of around 110 decibels at the source, comparable to standing near a large diesel lorry engine, but at 8 to 10 Hz, which rendered it completely silent. Test subjects positioned 50 meters, 164 feet, downrange, reported feelings of intense unease, nausea, and visual disturbance within 90 seconds of exposure. One RAF volunteer described the sensation as being drunk and seasick simultaneously, with the additional conviction that something terrible was about to happen. He could not say what or why. That, precisely, was the point. By early 1943, the Farnborough team had produced what they called the Mark II Fran device. The name derived, according to one account, from a simple transposition of Farn from Farnborough, though some records suggest it was a deliberate obscurantism to prevent accidental identification in captured documents. The Mark II weighed approximately 340 kilograms, 750 pounds, complete, could be transported on a modified 3-ton lorry, and required a crew of 4 to set up and operate. Its effective range, the distance at which physiological effects became reliably debilitating, was estimated at between 200 and 450 meters, 650, to nearly 1,500 feet, depending on atmospheric conditions and the direction of the prevailing wind. Production figures remain partially classified, but available records suggest that no more than a dozen complete units were ever built. Operational deployment of the Fran device was limited, carefully controlled, and often shrouded in the deliberate ambiguity that characterized so much of British wartime special operations. Several units are believed to have been positioned at coastal sites along the south and east of England, oriented to project their output seaward during Luftwaffe approach corridors. The intent was not to down aircraft, the device was not capable of that, but to induce disorientation, nausea, and panic in pilots at the most critical moment of their approach. Documented German responses are sparse, as one might expect. Captured Luftwaffe flight reports from 1943 and 1944 do, however, contain a recurring cluster of symptoms described by pilots returning from channel patrols: visual disturbance, loss of orientation, sudden and unexplained nausea, and, most significantly, an overwhelming sense of dread that pilots consistently struggle to account for. One Luftwaffe medical report from October 1943, declassified by the German Federal Archives in the 1990s, describes a pattern of psychological withdrawal among experienced channel pilots that medical staff attributed, inconclusively, to neurasthenic reaction to operational stress. The British, had they read it, would have recognized the symptoms precisely. Whether the Fran device was solely responsible for these effects, or merely one contributing factor among many, is impossible to say with certainty. The nature of psychological weapons is that their effects blend seamlessly with the ordinary terrors of combat. That ambiguity, of course, was part of the design. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And there is considerably more to this story still to come. The Germans were not, it must be said, entirely ignorant of the principles at work. By 1944, the Reich Research Council had circulated a series of theoretical papers on acoustic weapons, and at least one German physicist, Dr. Richard Woloschek at the Lofer Research Facility in Austria, had constructed what he called a Schallkanone, or sound cannon. The Woloschek device was, in several respects, a more ambitious undertaking than the British Fran, a pair of large parabolic reflectors, each roughly 3.2 meters, just over 10 feet, in diameter, mounted on a rotating turntable and driven by a methane-powered engine. The Schallkanone operated at audible frequencies rather than infrasonic ones, a critical difference. Woloschek's device produced a pulsed output at around 44 Hz, which is within the range of human hearing, creating a low, powerful drone rather than an inaudible vibration. The theoretical output was calculated at over 1,000 watts of acoustic power, enough, its designers hoped, to incapacitate a man at 50 meters and potentially kill at shorter ranges through the physical destruction of lung tissue. The practical results were deeply disappointing. Allied troops who encountered the device post-war at the Lofer facility reported that it produced a deeply unpleasant sensation, but was far from incapacitating under field conditions. The directional limitations were severe, the range was poor, and the device's sheer bulk. It required a considerable fixed installation, made it essentially useless in any dynamic military context. American technical intelligence officers who examined it in 1945 concluded, somewhat bluntly, that it was a curiosity rather than a weapon. The British approach had been fundamentally different in philosophy. Rather than attempting to cause direct physical harm through audible sound pressure, The Farnborough team had identified the gap between what could be heard and what could be felt, and had driven a weapon straight through it. By operating below the threshold of hearing, the Fran device rendered itself invisible. Its victims could not identify its source, could not report its characteristics accurately, and could not even be certain that what they were experiencing was an external attack rather than an internal failure of their own minds. Assessing the historical impact of the Fran device with confidence requires a degree of caution that the surviving records frankly demand. The weapon was never used in the way conventional armaments are used. There was no single battle in which it turned the tide, no measurable tally of aircraft downed or positions taken. Its effect was cumulative, psychological, and deliberately difficult to attribute. What the British achieved, arguably, was something more insidious and more durable than physical destruction. By introducing an element of inexplicable dread into the experience of Channel patrol, a dread that had no visible cause and resisted rational explanation, they added a layer of psychological attrition to an already punishing operational environment. Experienced pilots began to distrust their own perceptions. Medical staff struggled to account for a pattern of symptoms that had no conventional cause. The cumulative effect on morale among Luftwaffe Channel units, while impossible to quantify, appears, from the German medical records available, to have been genuine and not negligible. The Fran device also served as proof of concept for what became, in the post-war decades, a significant area of military and civilian research. Infrasound as a field of scientific inquiry expanded considerably after 1945, with researchers at institutions including the Bristol Aeroplane Company and, later, NATO's Acoustic Research Division, exploring both the effects of low-frequency sound on human physiology and the potential for using those effects in crowd control, area denial, and specialized military applications. Much of that research draws, directly or indirectly, on the work done in Farnborough between 1941 and 1944. As for surviving examples of the Fran device itself, the record is frustratingly incomplete. No complete unit is known to exist in any public museum or archive. Components believed to be from a Mark II device are held, though not currently displayed, in the collections of the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon. A partial technical manual, heavily redacted, was declassified by the National Archives at Kew in 2007 and has since been studied by a small number of specialists in the history of unconventional weapons. The full technical specifications remain, to this day, protected under extended classification orders, which suggests that someone, somewhere, still considers the underlying science to be of more than historical interest. Return, for a moment, to that Focke-Wulf pilot over the Channel. He will land safely. He will file his report in the clipped professional language that Luftwaffe procedure demands. He will describe visual disturbance, nausea, loss of motor control, and an irrational sense of terror for which he has no adequate explanation. His medical officer will note the symptoms, cross-reference them with a growing file of similar cases, and reach no firm conclusion. The pilot will be stood down for 48 hours and then return to duty. He will not fly over the Channel again. Not ever. He will request a transfer to the Eastern Front, a decision that, given the conditions there in late 1943, speaks volumes about the severity of what he experienced. He never knew what had happened to him. He would not have known where to look or how to listen for something that made no sound. The weapon that undid him was operating in a frequency range that simply did not exist in any human sensory experience. Below hearing, below conscious detection, working quietly on the organs of a man who had no idea he was being targeted. That invisibility was not a side effect. It was the entire point. In the conventional history of the air war, we measure success in sortie rates and kill ratios, in aircraft production figures and fuel consumption tables, in the vast industrial arithmetic of modern warfare. The Fran device does not fit neatly into any of those categories. It cannot be graphed on a chart of bomb tonnage. It cannot be measured in square miles of territory captured. What it represents instead is something rather more troubling: the discovery that the most effective way to defeat an enemy might be to make him doubt himself, to reach into his mind through the invisible medium of physics and introduce a terror that he could never quite name and never entirely escape. The British, in the quiet workshops of Farnborough, had not built a machine that killed. They had built something, in certain respects, more powerful than that. They had built a machine that made men afraid of the sky.